Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Doppo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. We can pause for just 1 second to take a look at maybe some of the geography just to get ourselves in place of in 1866, maybe starting in the north. What areas were actually in the Italian nation at this point? The South's locked in. What parts of the North are locked in and are still in play? And then what's the situation in the former papal state, which we're kind of inching closer and closer to 1870, where Rome, the city itself, gets taken into the project. But where are we at each of these individual areas and sections, you might say?
Mm-hmm. So in the north, we have a lot of the borders are very much the same. With the War of 1859, Savoy and Nice were ceded to France. So that's not a part of Italy, or technically. Basically, from the base of the Alp Mountains in the west, in modern-day Piedmont, to the borders of Milan to the east, that's the extent. 1866 was a war for Venice and the region Veneto. On top of this, they were also operating in the Tyrol region, which to Italians is called the Trentino. The Trentino is a very mountainous region. It is almost all mountain. This is where Garibaldi fought with his volunteers. He drove all the way to the main city of Trent, but they ended up not getting it in the peace settlement. In central Italy, the Papal States do still exist. They're a very small constituency. They're called the Principality of St. John or something, I believe, something like that. Mostly just Rome and its immediate environs. It's again not a very huge state. In the south of Italy, all of it is under control. And even though there's brigandage well up until the 20th century, the Italian state does not abide by any sort of rules when it comes to that. They just handled it. They handled their business and they handled the people there in very rough ways. but that's basically it's basically the Italy you see today minus Rome, minus Venice, minus Trent.
It's pretty amazing too in southern Italy. This is where the idea of the mafia really starts coming out of, and the different organized, what will become organized crime. But that's why they're secret organizations, is because if they're not, they're going to be absolutely crushed by this central state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And an interesting thing about the mafia, it's only first referenced by the Northerners in 1865, and they say that this is the origin of all the crime and all the violence in the South. It's not the taxes. It's not us showing up there and kicking the door in. It's the mafia. This is the problem. If we're able to handle the mafia, then the South will fall in line. And the mafia was a natural outcropping of the lack of law and order in Sicily, especially under Bourbon rule. Under Bourbon rule, soldiers wouldn't even patrol the interior of the island. So many Sicilians wouldn't have even known what a Bourbon soldier looked like unless it was too late. So the mafia sprang out of this. These were individuals who believed in private violence and private respect, and they had a code of honor that they upheld. If you chose not to abide by this code, you'd find yourself stabbed to death or outside of town. And it was similar in Naples. In Naples, they had the Camorra, and there's organizations like this all over the place. In Japan, they have this they have the triad and stuff like that. So this wasn't like some new specifically Italian thing. There's criminal organizations in Greece and Spain and all over the place. But specifically made the mafia a thing is that it controlled as a puppet master would, the organs of state, especially in Sicily. If you were a Sicilian politician, you had to work with the mafia, just like you had to work with the central Italian state. And you see in the future, Benito Mussolini hates people in the mafia the most because they're the only people who could be more of a gangster than he was. These were the people who commanded respect. Famously, Benito Mussolini goes to Piani dei Greci, which is where Garibaldi retreats to outside the gates of Palermo. And he meets with the local mayor, who's also the local mafioso. And he disdains this guy. He makes a point not to mention his name, but he says the mayor of Piani dei Greci, who couldn't stop himself from getting in all my photos, basically. This is literally what he said in the middle of Parliament. And it shows you, like, and they couldn't do anything about this. Italian politicians tried again and again to try and stop the mafia, but it just didn't work. There are very famous court cases in the 50s, right after World War II, where mafioso members are literally in bars in the middle of the courtroom, like it's a show trial. But even with that, you still see the mafia as a major player. And today they still exist. And definitely not in the same power or the same level of ability that they once had, but they still do exist. And it shows the ability of unlawfulness to sort of manifest, especially in a centralized state, if not more so. The more centralized Italy got, the worse the mafia became. It's a very strange arithmetic.
One of the more complicated things to wrap your mind around is the church and the state, because you have almost everyone is Catholic.
Yeah.
And the central state in the House of Savoy, and they want to connect themselves to the church, but you also kind of almost have like an ulcer in the middle of it, of the papal states that are saying, no, we're still a secular, we still have a secular government here. And as the Pope, Pius IX, I'm still the leader of the Catholic Church. I mean, that the conflict there is so multi-layered. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the few things that actually united the entire Italian peninsula was, like you said, religion. Almost everyone was Catholic. In the South, Sicily especially, they still practiced forms of animism and witchcraft, things like that. But for the most part, it was all under the guise of the Catholic religion. So the battle between the Catholic Church and the Italian state is one of the most well touched on of this period, probably. So in 1864, you have the first like olive branch from the Italian state to the church. Marco Minghetti, the prime minister, he comes up with the Convention of September. He says, we'll move the Italian capital from Turin to Florence so that for sure we don't want anything to do with Rome anymore. And in return, Napoleon moves his troops out of Rome. In reality, this was very shrewd politicking on Minghetti's part. But in the end, he didn't count on the people of Turin literally rising up and starting like a street battle for a whole day where like 80 people die or something. This leads to him resigning. And the next government is headed by the former general, La Marmora, who, like I said, he goes about centralizing. And he, of course, is Piedmontese along with everyone else in the government. So you see, and especially in the church, on top of this, with the September Convention, you have the syllabus of errors. This is something that maybe you could talk a little bit more on, but basically it was a document that disregarded liberalism. Liberalism was the antithesis of Catholicism. Any of these personal liberties he called them, quote unquote, abnormal to even vote, like abnormal to vote, and it deserved divine and human punishment. And you would expect both, presumably, when you die. But maybe you could talk about this a little bit more.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. Oh yeah, the syllabus of errors, and you can find it. You can find it written anywhere on the internet, and there's even several. I think it's for free on Audible. It's it's hard to read or listen to a document and actually laugh out loud because some of the stuff is so insane, especially by our modern, how we would think modern. But I have to think that, and people did back then. I think it was instead of laughing, people in England and in the United States and in more, what you might call classically liberally minded, they were probably more disgusted than laughed. But I mean, you almost can't help but laugh at these things are so absurd in the syllabus of errors. It's basically anything that's remotely modern and, like you said, is evil, and it's going to be punished. And that was out of somebody like Pius IX, who came in as a moderate liberal, and he's coming out with this stuff that, reactionary gets thrown out a lot, the term, but this is reactionary stuff. I mean, I really highly suggest, I'll get into the syllabus of errors in other episodes, but people should go out and listen to it or read it because it is a very telling document. This is what Pius IX is thinking at that point in history. And you want to know what somebody's thinking at a single point in history, it's the syllabus of errors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Pius also, if I'm not mistaken, he created the idea that of immaculate birth. That was his dogma.
Yeah, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that and it's those two things that he's fighting desperately to hold on to, is the religious power of the papacy, is the Pope is more or less the dictator of the church, and that the church that he's basically the secular dictator of this state that's almost gone by in the 1860s. But so the syllabus of errors comes out in 1864, and the ultimate victory of the ultramontane papacies won in the 1871 at the Vatican Church. And that's almost the papacy of where the Pope can come up with a statement like the Immaculate Conception of Mary. That all comes out in this very short time period where the church's temporal power is gone, but the papal, his religious power is absolutely ascendant. The 1864, that's when the syllabus of error comes out, and it's these 80 points, and it's a point. This is bad. This is really bad. The next, I mean, it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see how far to the right the church goes, especially in this period. And in a lot of ways, once the church loses its temporal authority, they actually gain power.
Yeah.
It's another strange dichotomy. They became the ultimate arbiter of welfare in Italy. I mean, the state wasn't doing anything to help the poorest. The church has been doing this for hundreds of years, and it was the ultimate counterbalance to socialism, which was spreading like wildfire in the north and the center. It only didn't spread in the south because, like I said, most of the people there were religious to the extreme, and they supported Catholic works and Catholic charity. They considered socialism godless and selfish.
Yeah, and with papal infallibility, this idea that the Pope, under certain circumstances, what he says is absolute truth. We kind of get the idea now, and the apologists will say it's only under certain circumstances, it's only on certain issues. But at that point, there was a real debate whether there should be no papal infallibility, or on the opposite, the maximalist position that anything the Pope says and teaches is infallible. And you kind of get this via media, that it's only under certain circumstances, and there really is at this point only certain issues were ever said ex cathedra that they were infallible. But Pius wanted to push the envelope on that. And like you said, we see that after the papal state is gone as a secular institution, that's when the papal authority goes, the religious authority just goes through the roof.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this sounds like a really great part to transition to the capture of Rome. So let's do that, I think.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, that's a fascinating story in and of itself. And at this point, as you jump in, what is the geographical limits? You say it's basically what we would consider the classical city of Rome, and then a little bit of the surrounding territory.
Yeah, just a little bit. Just the immediate north of Rome. Just a little bit of that. But that's about the extent of the papal range. But at this point, Venice is captured. It's sufficiently been controlled by Italy, even though most of the Venetians really didn't mind either way. They were like, "Oh, okay, well, we're Italian now, whatever." But with 1870, as that rolls around, there's another massive conflict. It's brewing in Central Europe. It's between Prussia and France. It's called the Franco-Piedmont War. As this conflict starts, Napoleon quickly grabs the garrison out of Rome. Oh, wait. Before we talk about this, let's go back a little bit more. 1867, this was Garibaldi's final march on Rome. So he grabs about 10,000 Italian volunteers. He marches on Rome, and in very similar fashion to 1848, Napoleon sends an expeditionary force of like 20,000 men and completely decimates Garibaldi's ranks. I mean, he loses like 1,000 men in an afternoon, which was a good portion of his force. And from that, the French garrison was reinstalled in Rome. So that was there. But with the Franco-Piedmont War, this garrison is removed, and there's a lot of like oscillating. Italy just sort of stands still. A lot of people are begging, pleading, take Rome. This is the time. But the prime minister, Giovanni Lanza, he says, no, I want to wait until a peaceful resolution is presented, and then we'll be able to have Rome. This was a huge controversy at the time. I mean, people were super against this guy for what he was doing. Famous leftist, who's a radical, wrote a famous poem. Giuseppe Carducci was the name of the guy. And in this poem, he's pleading with the geese of Rome to be quiet as Italy approaches the gates. He's like, please be quiet. Dr. Lanza doesn't want the rays of light to shine on Italy. But eventually, Napoleon's defeated at the Battle of Sedan. The German Empire is declared. The French Republic, the third one, is declared. The Paris Commune starts. And Italy finally marches on Rome. They blow a hole in the Aurelian walls at Porta Pia, and they take the city after token resistance from the Pope. It wasn't a massive battle. It was turned into this big, giant, amazing thing. It's still celebrated in Italy as one of the few national holidays. But in reality, people were pissed that this was the reason. This was how it was taken. We had to wait for Napoleon to get beat and his empire to collapse for Italy to assert itself on the world stage. So this was the start of nationalism. I mean, if you could really point to a spot, this was it. Even the new king, he didn't even want to visit Rome. He only visited much after the fact when there was the Tiber overflowed and killed a bunch of people. When he shows up at Rome, he said there's no crowds for him when he shows up. He just turns to his valet and he's like, we're finally here. And then he goes inside, and he felt as much of a prisoner in Rome as the Pope claimed to be. The first thing the Italian state does once they enter Rome and everything's set up, they give the Pope a really, really good deal. They basically say, and you can maybe get into this a little bit more, you're allowed a massive indemnity. They're going to pay the Pope. You're still allowed the 2 blocks in Vatican City. Your priests won't be upheld to the same standard of the law or censorship as everyone else. I mean, there's a famous story. There was an Italian patriot who died, and as he was supposed to be walked to his grave, the Italian tricolor that was on his casket was forcibly removed by a priest who said, I'm not walking with this thing. I won't do it. So they had to walk a separate route with the flag. It was a very strange dynamic that had to develop, especially considering that priests were some of the main figures of the Risorgimento. I mean, you can look at even as early as 1848, there was a priest named Ugo Bassi who fought on the walls of Rome and comforted dying men until they passed on either side. So it's not like the men of the cloth weren't well known to this struggle. They were a part of it, and they were one of the main arbiters for it, especially in these smaller towns where they didn't really understand the ideas of Italian unification. I mean, the most that they would get up to is, maybe their neighboring town has something that they want, and then there's big rivalry between these 2 small towns, and that was the whole world to them. They didn't care about Italian unification or Rome or capturing Rome. This was all brought to the forefront by a lot of these priests who, as well, were also some of the few people who taught children. You see, up until the Copino law in like the 1870s, which I'll get into later, the main arbiter of education is the priesthood, because they were also some of the few people who actually spoke Italian. It's something not a lot of people talk about, but only 2% of people in Italy could actually speak Italian. Everyone else spoke regional dialects. Cavour famously could barely speak Italian. He needed intense lessons on it. He was mostly a French speaker. And that's for most of the prime ministers. I mean, any of the Piedmont prime ministers you see, most of their first languages were French, sorry. But yeah, and with that, you see the initial start of this cult of the state. The first thing the right does, because they're the ones in power right now, is start to, ramp this up. The king and the state are number one. And in one of these strange dichotomies you see in Italian history all over the place, people like Garibaldi, people like Mazzini, you're not allowed to bring them up. They're persona non grata. They're a part of the left, so you can't talk about them. Italian unification happened thanks to the king, and that's it. That's what was taught. Now in Parliament, there's also at the same time one of the first massive scandals that happened, the rocked Parliament, 1868, 1869, right before Rome is captured. It's a tobacco monopoly was sold for pennies to a cabal of bankers. The rest of the money went directly to heads of parliament or the king himself. So people were incensed. I mean, and this was at the same time as the grist tax. The grist tax was a tax against the grinding of wheat and grain and nuts. And this was an insane tax. This affected the poorest of the poor, since most of the poorest's diet consisted of nothing but taking grain and grinding it into a paste, or chestnuts into a paste. And they would eat this paste. It was incredibly unhealthy for you, but it was sustenance, and that was all they had. And this is what was taxed. It was absolutely insane. On top of this, it was the third capital change in like 10 years. It cost an immense amount of money to do all this. I mean, at the end, Italy owed like $650 million to the banks of France and Great Britain. And the only thing that they could really think of to counterbalance is to sell church land or sell state land, or tax the eyes out of most of the southern population. It was such a bad state of affairs that between 1865 and 1871, direct taxes rose 65%. Indirect taxes, so like on food and like spices and stuff, rose 107%. I mean, this is unsustainable. On top of this, wages obviously didn't go up. They remained stagnant. And you see this even after this period. The GDP growth for all of this, the initial decades of Risorgimento, is like 0.8%. 1896, 0.8% growth since 1861. It was quite the thing. It created a real division between what they called real Italy and what they called legal Italy, which was the powers that be. And these people in legal Italy, they didn't visit their constituents. They didn't go to the towns that they were voted for. They didn't visit these places. They're especially the South. I mean, if you were elected in the South, you didn't go there. Why would you do that? They said that it was famous. They said that Africa started somewhere under Rome, and this was the incredibly racist beliefs of the time. On top of this, they used science and biology to justify their racism. There was a guy called Cesare Lombroso. He's the modern founder of criminology. So, and he himself was actually a very left-leaning guy. He was a socialist, and his ideas were supported by early socialists for the work he did on criminology. But he wanted to understand how criminals worked, because he saw the immense criminality of the southern population. He said there has to be a reason for that. Now, he didn't think about looking at socioeconomics or the state. He instead looked at the individual criminal. He looked at the body of a former brigand, and he discovered that whereas occipital ridge should have been, there was a depression. I don't remember the exact contours, but from this, he founded the idea of atavism. Atavism was the natural animalistic instincts inside all persons. Conveniently, the main factor for atavism was race. So depending on your race, you could have either more or less atavism. This obviously very quickly became super, super racist. I mean, conveniently, white people had the least atavists traits found. And because Southern Italians mixed so much with, the Middle East, with the Phoenicians, and with the North African Saracens, they had the most atavism in maybe the entire European continent. So that was used also to explain away Southern poverty and Southern criminals. It was ingrained, and this is how the Southern question started. And the Southern question is still posed today. It's still posed in the same racist context, just in a different way. Back in the day, they would say, "Oh, we can't live with these barbarian Sicilians, or they're gonna, destroy our culture." Now it's like, "Oh, I can't support these poor Sicilians because my taxes." It's the same argument, just in a different way. Same thing with the Southern strategy in the United States. It's a very similar take on a very similar thing, obviously in a different way. But still, there was it's worth pointing out that this still exists. Even in 1996, as late as that, there was a separatist Northern Party who wanted nothing to do with Southern Italians. And this was the way of things. This was a way that a lot of Northern Italians viewed Southern Italy. And it just increased once they realized the amount of like religiosity in the countryside. This was a lot of these Northern politicians came from Cavour's generation, which was inherently anti-clerical. I mean, one of the first things Cavour did when he was prime minister was try to get rid of a bunch of church land and a bunch of abbeys and societies that didn't do anything for the state. And with Rome's capture, you see just more of this. You see the invasion of Northern speculators into Rome itself. I mean, building starts overnight, and they want to turn Rome into a modern capital for a modern state. Now, this wasn't the only opinion. A lot of people didn't even want Rome as the capital. I mean, Massimo D'Azeglio said it was like you could see the miasma of 2,000 years pervading off of it. Other people wanted to build a separate capital in Umbria, like Washington, D.C., but everyone otherwise wanted the Eternal City. I mean, from Garibaldi to the king to, whichever way you want to look at it. So it was imperative that they take it, and they did end up taking it eventually.